I welcome you to this presentation on data-driven research and teaching in experimental physics. My name is Christoph Koch. I'm head of the Structure Research and Electron Microscopy at the Physics Department of Humboldt-Universität of Berlin. And today I'm going to present you my thoughts on how it is possible to include this topic of data science and in particular big data also in educating students in physics. So when I try to prepare for this presentation, knowing that I'm talking to students, I thought, well, maybe I should really look at this topic from a bit more further away and looking also what the education that physics students get in at least our university, and I assume this is very similar to other universities in Germany as well, and also how they are prepared for really dealing with big data and how to include this topic then in their research. Discuss some of the challenges that we have in condensed matter physics in particular, some of the prerequisites. And I will present you a few examples so that you see what I'm talking about when I talk about this topic from our lab, and also how students are involved in working in this lab, and at the very end a few summarizing notes. How well does our school system prepare people for studying physics? Students are not very well prepared to actually deal with uncertainties and with the fact that measurements are not always certain, and how to deal and calculate the propagation of errors and so on. And another issue is that only a small percentage of students really learn programming. My experience teaching a course in computational physics at the Department of Physics at Humboldt-University is that only a very small percentage of students actually have prior exposure to programming languages and have actually had programmed some project on their own. There is this subject on the rise that's at the bottom here, that data science becomes a very interesting field in physics. It's propping up in some parts of physics where you have very homogeneous data, but it's taking more and more prevalence as we see other fields of science and society really thrive with this topic. I mean, data science, as you know, and evaluating social media data and so on, it's a big deal. We should profit from this also in the field of physics. And I'm actually a big supporter of this idea. So here's, I showed this little example. This is in principle what it exemplifies very much of what I think of data science and physics can help us do. So you can see here, this is a very famous data set of some data points that all have the same statistical characterization. So they have the same mean, they have the same standard deviation. And if you fit a line through them, this line, basically the parameters describing this line is the same in all four cases. Yet when we look at this data, we see that the data should be interpreted differently. Right? So in this case, for example, you think, oh yeah, there should be a parabola fitted through the data. All this is not really contained in the fundamental statistics that we teach in school, and that even we teach in physics. When we evaluate data, we learn about standard deviation, about mean values and so on, maybe about correlations, but we don't learn actually to really handle all these very complex questions of, for example, finding patterns in data. So here's another example, a more recent basic example of this 1973 Anscombe dataset. So these people have developed a simulated annealing algorithm to generate data that has the same mean in X and Y, same standard deviation X and Y, same correlation coefficient, but yet you can see there are underlying patterns in this data that are just not described by these statistics. In my opinion, this is exactly what we can benefit from when we apply data science techniques in physics. These data science techniques can help us to find underlying patterns that are not really apparent using conventional statistical methods that we're used to apply. The idea is that artificial intelligence, of course, this buzzword, can give us new knowledge from just automatically analyzing large amounts of our experimental data and we don't even have to tell it what to find. It will find information and correlations and structure and patterns in the data for us. Well, that's, of course, in principle not totally wrong, but it has, at least in physics, only been shown to work in a few areas. And some of these areas are, of course, you can denoise data, or you can solve some inverse problems with, for example, artificial neural networks and other techniques. You can do classification, predicting of complex materials properties also from much more simple properties that are easy to determine. But these are a few niche applications where this has been shown to be very successful. But what is common to these examples is that often all the data is from the same source, or at least if it's not from the same source, for example, in computational physics or computational material science, these are a few well-defined sources, and they have been somehow equalized. So they have been has been a lot of work invested into actually making the numbers comparable, and also uncertainty. How do you deal with that? I mean, uncertainty can be described maybe with a few parameters. Maybe you don't have no uncertainty, or at least there is some well understood noise property that you can assign to the data. But the challenges that go much beyond these examples are, for example, when you have to compare data from different sources where you can't really make them on the same level. You may not even know very much information about these different sources. And especially when the experimental techniques, it's impossible to fully characterize the equipment that you use to acquire the data, or how much trust should you put in different sources that you get your data from. And you can see here's a nice example from the field that I work in. I work in the field of electron microscopy, and this is not the type of microscopy that we do. We do more high resolution work and spectroscopy and so on, but these are scanning electron microscope images, and you can see a data set consisting of 22,000 images that were all collected, and here it comes on the same microscope, right? This is not comparing data from different labs, but all collected in the same labs. There it was very nicely possible to apply these machine learning algorithms and do automatic classification of these data and so on. But as I said already, all this data stems from the same instrument, and the challenge is, how do you combine data that comes from different laboratories? Also, another issue is, of course, that some of these physics experiments, they collect huge amounts of data in a very short time, right? You have enormous data rates. For example, at CERN, you generate 115 petabytes per year. That's like 3.6 gigabytes per second. But even these detectors that we have on our microscopes, they collect data that's almost at the same range, at the same speed. And high-speed cameras nowadays can collect 30 gigabytes and more per second of data. You have then a large variety in this data. So all the 4 V's of big data apply also in the field of physics, and in particular the field that I work in when we do these electron microscopy experiments here. Prerequisites for applying data science in physics means before you can even start to process this data with your advanced algorithm, your artificial neural network, or whatever machine learning algorithm you have in mind, you need to first define a common language to describe your metadata. You need to also translate between different communities that define data potentially slightly different. You need to have file formats that you can read, that you can translate from one to the other. This seems very technical, but it's often a big challenge, especially when you have equipment that is produced by manufacturers that don't want to use publicly accessible file formats. And then you need to somehow populate databases. You need to create all these data that are well described with metadata and make it available to others, and even in your own lab, just collect it and have everybody in the lab work on the same page and do the data collection in a comparable manner that helps you then compare data between different experiments, even if it's done on the same microscope or the same instrument. And of course, you need to have infrastructure if you want to then apply big data methods to train your models and so on. So there's a number of issues that are really very challenging, and that need to be done first before you can actually do the data science, which involves extracting knowledge from data that you collected. So here's an example just to show you how complex this can be from the field that we work in, where you have a sample that you processed in some way. It has some history that it's gone through, some thermal annealing and whatever. This is the initial sample, then it's processed by some annealing or temperature and oxidation, whatever steps. Then you prepare a thin sample from it, you cut a very small region out of it, and then from that small region you really investigate only a very small area to see where the atoms are, what the interface looks like, and so on. And all this requires you to describe the sample, the processing of the sample, and also the area that you collected your data from. All this information is in principle important afterwards. It needs to be collected, needs to be presented in a structured manner so that it can be interpreted later on in order to make this data fair. That means findable, accessible, interpretable, and interoperable, and also reusable by others, not only the person that collected the data itself. So when preparing our samples, of course, we need to already start collecting information. And this is why we start working with these electronic lab notebooks that help us to collect the information already when we start taking the first look at the sample. We collect images of it, and as we process it, we collect more images and store all this information in a web-based electronic lab notebook. And then this information gets stored there. It can be pulled again to the software that we do the data acquisition in, and then this information that we collect on the microscope gets added to it, and again the metadata is stored in the electronic lab notebook. The data is stored elsewhere because it's oftentimes way too big to be stored there. And then once we process the data, we can pull it again into the software that we do the processing in, and afterwards push that meta information that we produced doing the processing again to the database. So here's an example what this looks like. It's also a student has then been tasked to develop an interface that allows you to really directly from the data acquisition software that we acquire the data on the microscope in, we can now actually interface with this electronic lab notebook and push data to the database. And you can see now the data that has just been acquired basically in the software is now pushed on this database, and there it's actually stored now in a structured manner in a JSON file, so that we can also then edit this JSON file if we like to, but we have it in a structured manner that we can really compare apples with apples at the end, and we know what we defined all these different metadata items as. The benefit of having students work with such databases for the experiments, and all students work basically on the same database, means that when they collect their data in this structured metadata format, that they have a guidance of how the metadata should be collected, and also know when the data is complete and when it's not complete, when there's something missing. And the results that they acquire and upload to the database can then be immediately discussed with the advisor, because that person doesn't even need to be in the lab to look at it, could be actually even from vacation or wherever. Students experience the value of sharing data because they also see the data that other students and other lab people in the lab have collected. And this really starts to become a value because they can really look beyond their own experiment and see and learn what the variation, for example, of data can be, what other systems behave under similar conditions, and so on. The availability of structured data in this database that you build up in this way enables then that you also start to have data science projects in your particular field of physics. And of course, students get a much bigger picture of what their data actually does and how it fits in to the whole field and how it should be interpreted in the context of other data that is collected in a similar manner. And because it's all available and you can search for it, you can compare it, and so on, that is actually a big advantage. Even though I focused mostly on the small area that my group and I work in, this area of materials-related physics, you probably have been reminded of how complex and how diverse the field of physics is, even if you just look at the field of condensed matter physics, but also, of course, in the much bigger and broader area. You have a huge variety of experimental data that are collected by different labs with different cultures to describe the data, different instruments. Some instruments may be proprietary, you don't have access to all the metadata. And a lot more needs to be invested into really making data fair and shareable. And this really requires not just that we invest a little bit, but it really requires a change in culture, that we value data that we can also then give to others. And this change in culture needs to start with the students, because these are the future generations of researchers that will then carry on and develop this further. And once you collect data that you can share with others and give to others with a good conscience, it's also data that has more value to your own work. And I think if students realize this in their own theses, and if they have advisors that really train them to think in this manner, this will really help a lot in producing more data that can be then used in data science techniques. And fair data will then become, of course, available also for further use, new types of projects, data science projects in physics, and so on. And this, of course, relates also to the third item here, that bachelor and master theses also benefit very much by having data in a structured manner, and they almost write themselves because all the information is already available. Of course, also including lectures on machine learning and data science methods in computational courses in physics curricula is an important thing, because once you've taught students the power and the capabilities of this, and they realize it's not something that is magic, but it can be done also by themselves, then there will be new and very creative ideas of how to really use data to extract knowledge in physics. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention.